esteem. Let's go back to the very beginning, because this is the part that confuses people the most, and honestly, the part that keeps people stuck long after everything falls apart. Esteem. When a narcissistic relationship starts, it does not start with cruelty. It does not start with neglect. It starts with intensity, with charm, esteem, with a sense that something extraordinary is happening. And that's important to say out loud, because if it started badly, no one would stay. In the beginning, you feel chosen, seen, esteem, valued in a way that feels almost cinematic. The attention is focused, intentional, and often overwhelming in a way that feels flattering. Messages come constantly, esteem. Conversations go deep very quickly. They want to know everything about you, your history, your struggles, your dreams, your insecurities. And it feels intimate. It feels like connection, esteem. It feels like someone finally gets you. But what's actually happening is not mutual discovery. It's assessment. It's information gathering. They're learning what lights you up, esteem. What makes you feel special? What makes you doubt yourself and where you've been hurt before? Because those details will matter later. Not consciously to you, but strategically to them, esteem. This phase often moves fast, faster than feels reasonable, but it doesn't register as unreasonable because it feels so good. Big emotions appear early, declarations of love, esteem, statements about destiny, soulmates, or finally finding the one. There's a sense of urgency, like something precious could be lost if it's not locked down right now. And again, esteem, we're taught to interpret that as romance. But healthy connection is not rushed, it unfolds. This doesn't unfold, it accelerates. You may notice how aligned everything feels. Same values, esteem, same interests, same sense of humor, same worldview. It can feel uncanny, like you've met your mirror. And in a way, you have. Because mirroring is central to this phase, esteem. They reflect you back to yourself, not because they are deeply compatible, but because reflection builds trust fast, esteem. It creates the illusion of being profoundly understood without requiring vulnerability on their part. And let me be clear about something, your reaction to this phase is normal, esteem. You are not foolish for believing it. You are not naive for being swept up. This works on people who are emotionally intelligent, empathic, and capable of deep connection. In fact, esteem. It works best on people who value closeness, meaning, and authenticity. This isn't about weakness, it's about wiring. During this time, you may feel like the best version of yourself, esteem. More confident, more alive, more hopeful. You might think, why didn't I know love could feel like this? And that feeling becomes incredibly important later, because when it disappears, esteem. You don't just miss them, you miss who you were when you were being idealized. Your sense of worth quietly becomes tethered to their attention, esteem. There's often a subtle sense of exclusivity that forms here, an us against the world feeling. They may position themselves as the only one who truly understands you. Other relationships, esteem, friends, family, are gently minimized, not overtly criticized at first, just reframed as less important, less aligned, less supportive than this connection. And slowly, without realizing it, esteem, your world starts to narrow. Red flags do appear in this phase, but they're easy to overlook because the emotional reward is so high, esteem. You might notice how past relationships are always framed as someone else's fault. You might see flashes of entitlement, lack of empathy, or subtle arrogance. But you explain it away, esteem. Everyone has flaws, no one's perfect. And besides, look at how good this feels. This is where intuition often whispers, but it's drowned out by dopamine, by hope, esteem, by the desire for the story to be true. And so you override your discomfort, you give the benefit of the doubt. You stay open, you stay generous. And again, that generosity is not the problem, esteem, it's simply being exploited. What's also happening in this phase is attachment is being formed very quickly. Your nervous system is learning that closeness equals intensity, esteem, that attention equals safety, that being adored equals being secure. This creates a powerful bond before trust has been earned. So later, when the dynamic shifts, esteem, leaving doesn't feel like a rational choice, it feels like withdrawal. And people will often say, but it wasn't fake, it felt real. And they're right, your feelings were real, esteem. The connection you experienced was real to you. What wasn't real was the stability of it. What wasn't real was the consistency. What wasn't real was the capacity to sustain it without control, esteem. This phase is also where expectations get set without being discussed. You learn implicitly that closeness looks like constant contact. That love looks like intensity, esteem. That chemistry looks like urgency. And when those things inevitably fade, you don't see it as a warning, you see it as something you need to fix, esteem. Another important piece here is how much this phase relies on fantasy. Not in a silly way, but in a psychological way. You're being cast into a role, the perfect partner, the solution, esteem, the missing piece. And being cast like that feels incredible. But roles are not identities. And eventually, no real human can live up to a projection, esteem. This is also why people struggle so much with the question, was it all a lie? Because it feels unbearable to think that something so meaningful could be entirely false. Esteem. But the truth is more nuanced. The feelings were real, the structure was not safe, and both of those things can exist at the same time. As this phase progresses, esteem, you may already be subtly adapting. You might prioritize their needs. You might make yourself more available. You might overlook things you normally wouldn't. Esteem. And it doesn't feel like self-abandonment yet, it feels like investment, like building something special. But here's the critical thing to understand, esteem. This phase is not the blueprint for the relationship. It's the bait. It's designed to bond you before you have enough information to make an informed choice. And once that bond is formed, esteem, the power dynamic can shift. People often cling to this phase later as proof of what the relationship really was. They say, esteem, if we could just get back to that. But that version only existed under conditions of idealization and control. It was not a shared reality, esteem. It was a performance designed to secure attachment. And that's the part that's hardest to grieve, not just losing the person, but losing the story. Esteem. Losing the belief that you finally found something safe and extraordinary. Losing the hope that all the pain later on was leading back to this beginning. Esteem. So if you take nothing else from this part of the timeline, take this: the beginning was powerful not because it was love, but because it was emotionally immersive. Esteem. And anything that hooks you this fast without knowing you fully is not building intimacy, it's building dependency. If the start feels like magic, esteem, it's worth asking what it's asking you to ignore, and then something begins to shift, but not in a way that sets off alarms. There's no sharp turn, no dramatic reveal. If anything, esteem. That's what makes this phase so disorienting, because if it were obvious, you'd leave. Instead, it unfolds quietly, almost politely, esteem, while you're still holding the memory of how good it once felt. The intensity starts to soften. Not disappear, just thin out. Messages come a little later. Enthusiasm feels muted. Esteem. The warmth that once felt effortless now feels conditional. And you notice it, but you don't name it. You tell yourself this is normal. Relationships settle. The honeymoon phase ends. Esteem. This must be what real connection looks like. And that explanation keeps you anchored longer than you realize. This is where control begins to enter, but it doesn't arrive as domination. Esteem, it arrives as guidance, as honesty, as concern, comments about your reactions, suggestions about how you could communicate better, observations about your tone, your sensitivity, esteem, your expectations. None of it sounds cruel on its own. In fact, it often sounds reasonable, and that's the danger. You start receiving feedback you didn't ask for, but it's framed as helpful. Esteem as insight, as them trying to make the relationship work. And because you still believe this person is on your side, you listen, you adjust, you internalize. You think, maybe they're right, esteem. Maybe I do need to work on this. This is where self-questioning begins to replace self-trust. You might bring up something that hurt you, esteem. Something that would have been met with care in the beginning. But now the response feels different. You're told you're overthinking, or being dramatic, or misremembering. And again, esteem. It's subtle. There's no yelling, no outright denial of reality. Just enough deflection that you walk away unsure of yourself. And that uncertainty becomes a theme. Esteem. Gaslighting in this phase doesn't feel like manipulation, it feels like confusion. You replay conversations in your head. You wonder if you misunderstood. Esteem. You start asking yourself whether your expectations are too high. And because the relationship still contains moments of connection, you don't see this as a red flag. Esteem. You see it as a communication issue you need to solve. Inconsistency becomes the emotional backdrop. Some days feel almost like the beginning, warm, connected, easy. Other days feel distant, esteem, tense, cold. And there's no clear explanation for the difference. So you start scanning for clues. What did I say? What did I do? What mood are they in today? Esteem. This is where your nervous system gets pulled into the dynamic. You're no longer relaxed in the relationship, you're vigilant. You're monitoring tone, timing, expression, esteem. You're trying to anticipate reactions. And you don't call this anxiety, you call it caring. What's happening here is intermittent reinforcement, esteem, unpredictable moments of closeness mixed with withdrawal. And that pattern is incredibly powerful, because every time you get a glimpse of the old warmth, it renews your hope. You think, esteem, they're okay. And that keeps you invested, even as the overall experience becomes more painful. Boundaries start to feel risky now. When you express a need, esteem, it's met with defensiveness or irritation. When you say no, it's framed as selfish or ungrateful. When you ask for clarity, you're told you're creating problems. And slowly, esteem, you learn that advocating for yourself comes at a cost, so you do it less. You don't decide to abandon yourself. You adapt. Confusion becomes your baseline. You're not miserable all the time, esteem. You're not happy either. You're unsettled. Something feels off, but you can't quite name it. And when you try to talk about that feeling, it's often turned back on you. Esteem, you're told you're negative, or too sensitive, or impossible to please, so you stop talking about it, you hold it in. And that isolation, being alone with your doubt, esteem, deepens the bond instead of breaking it. From the outside, the relationship may still look functional. They can still be charming, still successful, still impressive, esteem. And because there's no obvious crisis, you don't feel justified in leaving. You tell yourself all relationships take work, that love means compromise, that you're being tested, esteem. But healthy relationships don't require you to lose your footing to stay connected. Another shift that happens here is accountability starts to disappear. Conflicts don't resolve, esteem. They dissolve, or they're flipped. You bring up a concern and suddenly the conversation is about your delivery, your flaws, your emotionality. You walk in wanting to be heard, esteem, and you walk out apologizing. Again, over time, you learn that repair doesn't really happen. There's no true acknowledgement of harm. No sustained effort to change, esteem. Just enough smoothing over to keep things going. And that creates a quiet hopelessness. Because you're working so hard and nothing is actually getting better. Loneliness creeps in, esteem. Not because you're alone, but because you're no longer emotionally met. You miss the connection you once had. You grieve it quietly. And instead of seeing that grief as a signal, esteem, you see it as motivation to try harder. Self-blame takes root here. You start thinking, if I were calmer, more patient, less needy, more confident, you make it about you, esteem, because that gives you a sense of control. If the problem is you, then the solution is self-improvement, not leaving. And that belief keeps you tethered, esteem. What's important to understand is that this phase isn't random, it's structural. The relationship is reorganizing around power. Your doubt feeds their control, esteem. Your accommodation reinforces their entitlement. And because this happens gradually, it feels normal by the time it's entrenched. You may start walking on eggshells without realizing it, esteem. You choose words carefully, you avoid topics, you manage moods, you become responsible for emotional stability that isn't yours to carry, esteem. And this hypervigilance becomes so familiar that you forget what ease feels like. At some point in this phase, a quiet question often appears, esteem. Father, is this what it's supposed to feel like? But the question is quickly buried under fear, hope, obligation, and investment. You've already put so much into this. You remember how it started, esteem. You believe it can return. But here's the truth that's hard to accept: this phase is not a temporary glitch. It's the direction. It's the bridge between idealization and devaluation, esteem. And once you start doubting yourself more than you doubt the relationship, the ground has already shifted beneath you, esteem. Because the moment you stop trusting your own perception is the moment someone else gains the upper hand. And when confusion becomes the cost of connection, esteem, something essential has already been lost. And then, almost without realizing it, you find yourself living in a version of the relationship that barely resembles how it began, esteem. This is usually the point where people say, I don't know when it happened, but I stopped feeling like myself. And that's not accidental, esteem. This phase is where devaluation becomes the emotional atmosphere you're breathing every day, not dramatic enough to name easily, but constant enough to change you. By now, esteem, the warmth is inconsistent at best. The admiration that once felt effortless has been replaced by critique, dismissal, or indifference. You're no longer lifted up, you're managed, corrected, esteem, tolerated, and the shift is subtle enough that you don't protest it, you adapt to it. The criticism becomes more personal now. It's no longer about a specific behavior, esteem, it's about your character. You're too emotional, too sensitive, too much, or somehow never enough. These comments may be framed as jokes, as honesty, as frustration, but they land, esteem. And over time, they reshape how you see yourself. What's especially damaging is that the criticism often comes paired with withdrawal. Affection is no longer freely given, it's earned, esteem. You notice that when you agree, when you stay quiet, when you don't challenge them, things are calmer. Not loving, not warm, just calmer, esteem. And so you learn the rules without ever being told what they are. You start editing yourself. You soften opinions. You delay reactions, esteem. You second guess whether something is worth bringing up. And slowly, your inner world becomes smaller. You're not doing this consciously, you're doing it to survive the relationship, esteem. One of the most painful parts of this phase is emotional starvation. You may still talk every day. You may still share space. But emotionally, you're alone. When you try to connect, esteem, the response is dismissive or distracted. When you're hurt, you're told you're overreacting. When you need reassurance, you're made to feel needy or inconvenient. Eventually, you stop asking. Esteem. Comparison often shows up here, and it cuts deep. You're compared to exes, co-workers, friends, even hypothetical people. Sometimes directly, sometimes subtly. The message is always the same. Esteem, you're falling short. And that comparison keeps you striving, proving, performing, trying to earn a sense of safety that never fully arrives. At this stage, gaslighting is no longer subtle esteem, it's embedded. Conversations end with you feeling confused, apologetic, and ashamed, even when you walked in with a legitimate concern esteem. The focus shifts away from what happened and onto how you reacted, your tone, your delivery, your flaws, and slowly, you stop trusting your own memory, your own instincts, esteem, your own emotional responses. You may start wondering if you're actually the problem. Self-doubt becomes constant. You question whether your needs are reasonable, esteem, whether your expectations are too high, whether you're just difficult to love. And that doubt is incredibly powerful, esteem, because it keeps you invested in fixing yourself instead of questioning the relationship. There's often a quiet sense of embarrassment here. On paper, things might look fine, esteem. The other person may still appear charming, competent, even admirable to the outside world, so you don't talk about what's happening. You feel isolated in your experience, esteem. And that isolation deepens the bond, because the relationship becomes the only place you're trying to get validation, even though it's the place withholding it, esteem. You may also notice that your joy is subtly punished. If you're excited about something that doesn't involve them, it's ignored or minimized. If you succeed, esteem, the response is lukewarm or competitive. And over time, you learn to dim yourself, to not take up too much space, to not shine too brightly. Walking on eggshells becomes normal, esteem. You're constantly scanning for mood shifts. You're adjusting to emotional weather you don't control. You're managing their reactions while neglecting your own needs, esteem. And your nervous system stays in a state of hypervigilance that you mistake for devotion. This is where many people feel the deepest erosion of identity. You don't recognize yourself anymore, esteem. Your confidence is gone, your voice feels smaller, your world feels narrower. And yet, leaving feels impossible because the very thing that's been eroded is the thing you'd need to walk away, esteem, self-trust. What's important to understand is that the narcissistic partner often appears perfectly fine during this phase. They may even seem more confident, more stable, more in control, esteem, because the relationship is now structured around their needs. Your accommodation reinforces their entitlement. Your self-doubt feeds their sense of superiority, esteem. And this imbalance starts to feel normal, not because it is, but because it's been normalized over time. You might start asking yourself quietly, esteem, is this all there is? But the question is quickly buried under fear, obligation, and hope. Fear of being alone, obligation because you've invested so much, esteem. Hope because you remember how it began. And so you stay telling yourself that if you just try harder, love will return. But here's the hard truth, esteem. This phase is not about you failing to be enough. It's about a dynamic that requires you to shrink in order to continue. Devaluation is not a response to your shortcomings, esteem. It's a strategy of control. And once that pattern is in place, no amount of self-improvement will restore the relationship to something healthy, esteem. Because the relationship now depends on your self-doubt to function. By the time this phase is fully entrenched, you're no longer fighting to be loved. You're fighting to be tolerated, esteem. You're negotiating for scraps of affection. You're trying to earn basic respect. And that constant striving is exhausting. But let me say this clearly, the version of you that feels small, esteem, anxious, and inadequate in this phase is not the real you. It's a trauma-adapted version of you, a version shaped by chronic invalidation and emotional neglect. And that distinction matters, esteem, because it means this is not a personality flaw, it's a survival response. Devaluation doesn't reveal who you are, esteem. It reveals what happens when someone needs to diminish another person to feel powerful. And when a relationship requires you to disappear to stay in it, the cost has already become too high, esteem. And then comes the moment most people think will be obvious, the moment when the relationship ends. But in narcissistic relationships, the ending rarely looks the way we expect, esteem. There's rarely a clear argument, a decisive confrontation, or a dramatic exit. More often, the ending arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, esteem, even though the damage has been mounting for months or years. Sometimes it's sudden, sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes they leave, sometimes they stay physically present, but emotionally absent, esteem. But the effect is the same. You feel like you've lost someone, even if they're still in your life. This is what's called the discard phase, esteem. And it's disorienting because it doesn't look like a traditional breakup. It doesn't come with closure or explanation. Sometimes they walk away completely, esteem, leaving you with emptiness and questions that will linger for years. Other times they remain nearby, withdrawing love, attention, esteem, and emotional support so thoroughly that you might be physically present in the relationship, but emotionally you're completely alone. Both versions are equally painful, esteem. The discard always brings the absence of empathy to the forefront. Your confusion, your heartbreak, your need for answers, it doesn't matter to them. You might try to have a conversation, esteem, to understand what went wrong, to seek clarity, and you're met with indifference or irritation. There is no meaningful dialogue, no acknowledgement of harm, no sense of accountability, esteem. And that absence of recognition, the lack of even a basic acknowledgement of your reality, is what keeps people feeling stuck long after the relationship ends, esteem. Many describe this phase as the most painful part, not because the relationship was good at the end, but because the loss is so destabilizing. You're grieving not just a person, esteem, but the hope you carried through the confusion, the erosion, the moments when you tried so hard to make it work. That hope becomes a trap because when it's stripped away, esteem, it leaves you disoriented. You feel as though the person you invested in no longer exists, or worse, they never really existed the way you thought they did. And to make matters more confusing, esteem, the narcissistic partner often appears untroubled by the ending. They may move on quickly, they may replace you. They may seem lighter, freer, happier, even relieved, esteem. This contrast is devastating. You're left thinking, did it ever mean anything? Was I imagining the connection? And that self-doubt compounds the pain, esteem. It can make you question your own judgment, your worth, your reality. The discard phase often triggers a surge of self-blame. You replay every interaction, esteem, analyzing what you could have done differently. If only I had been more patient, less emotional, more understanding. You internalize the narrative that somehow you failed, esteem. And that's exactly what the dynamic is designed to do, to keep you tethered to a sense of responsibility that doesn't belong to you, esteem. Because when the other person leaves without accountability, your mind fills in the gaps with explanations that put the burden on you. Esteem, another cruel aspect of this phase, is that it often leaves you without resolution. Apologies are rare or superficial. Explanations are vague or deflective, esteem. The closure that allows you to grieve and move forward is withheld intentionally or unintentionally. And without that closure, your nervous system remains activated. You're caught in a loop, esteem, wondering what went wrong, revisiting moments over and over, trying to make sense of a fundamentally senseless dynamic. You may also experience emotional abandonment in this phase, esteem, which is more painful than physical abandonment because it undermines your sense of safety. The person who once seemed invested, attentive, esteem, and attentive to your needs now acts as if you are a burden. They are unavailable to your pain, to your grief, to your humanity, esteem. And the emotional emptiness this creates can feel like a second trauma layered on top of the first. For some, the discard doesn't even come as a clean break. They are left in limbo, esteem, breadcrumbed, given just enough contact to reopen old wounds, but not enough to heal. Ambiguity keeps hope alive when finality is what you need, esteem. It keeps you tethered to the idea that maybe they will return, maybe they'll change, maybe the story can still be salvaged, esteem. And that lingering hope can prolong the cycle of emotional suffering for months or even years. It's crucial to understand that the discard is not a reflection of your value. The abruptness, esteem, the indifference, the lack of accountability, these are not about you. They are about the other person's relational capacity. When someone can disengage from a relationship without empathy, esteem, without concern, without care, it tells you something important about who they are, not about who you are. This phase often forces a reckoning. It's the moment when the illusion of love, esteem, consistency, and connection is stripped away, leaving nothing but the facts of the dynamic. And it can feel like your reality has been shattered. You're confronted with the truth, esteem. The relationship you were fighting for is gone if it ever truly existed. The grief you experience in this phase is multi-layered. You grieve the person, the relationship, esteem, the future you envisioned, and the version of yourself that existed in that relationship. You may feel shame, regret, confusion, sadness, and anger all at once, esteem. And it's important to honor all of these feelings. They are natural and they are necessary. The grief is part of the process of reclaiming yourself. At the same time, esteem, clarity begins to emerge. You begin to see patterns. You begin to recognize that the cycle was not random, that the idealization, the confusion, the erosion, esteem, and the discard were all connected. And with that recognition comes power. Because understanding the pattern shifts the question from what did I do wrong to what was I involved in, esteem. And that shift matters. It matters because the discard does not define your worth. It reveals the limits of someone who is incapable of love that is safe, consistent, and mutual, esteem. It shows you the reality of the relationship, not the fantasy that your hope had been sustaining. For many, the discard is also a catalyst, esteem. It's the moment that forces you to confront the dynamic and consider what it will take to protect yourself moving forward. It's the point where the patterns become visible enough to name, esteem. And once they are named, you can begin to reclaim your own life. You can begin to rebuild boundaries. You can begin to invest in people who are capable of mutual respect empathy, esteem, and consistency. And while the discard is painful, it can also be liberating. Because when the emotional supply is cut off, the illusion that kept you tethered begins to dissolve, esteem. And in that emptiness, clarity begins to emerge. You begin to realize that what you were holding on to, the hope, the explanations, the longing, wasn't a reflection of reality, esteem. It was a reflection of a cycle that depended on your participation to continue. At this point, people often discover a kind of awakening, esteem. They start to understand that the ending was not the loss of love, but the end of a pattern that was never sustainable, esteem. They start to see that their self-worth does not depend on someone who is unwilling or incapable of giving care and consistency. And in that recognition lies the first step toward freedom, esteem. The discard is painful because it forces you to confront the truth of the relationship. But that confrontation is also the beginning of clarity, the beginning of self-trust, esteem, and the beginning of reclaiming your own life. The person who discards you may never fully acknowledge the harm they've caused, but that does not diminish the fact that you deserve safety, esteem, respect, and genuine connection. And so the discard phase, as painful as it is, also contains the seeds of empowerment. Because the moment you see the cycle for what it truly is, esteem, the moment you understand that the loss is theirs as much as, or more than, yours, you begin to take back your power. You begin to see that what you were holding on to was not love, esteem. It was a dynamic built on control, inconsistency, and self-doubt. And the truth is simple: when someone can walk away without regard for the wreckage left behind, the loss is not yours, esteem. It is theirs. And just when you think you've reached the end, when you've finally begun to accept the loss, when you're learning to live with the absence, when you're starting to heal, esteem, that's often when they come back. Not dramatically, not in grand gestures, but in small, subtle ways. A text, a call, a message that says, esteem, I've been thinking about you, or I miss what we had, or I didn't realize what I lost. And suddenly, your world tilts again, because your hope, your longing, esteem, your old attachment gets triggered. This is what people refer to as the hoovering phase, because it's an attempt to suck you back into the relationship, to reel you in, esteem. And it's important to understand that hoovering isn't about love or reconciliation. It's about access. They want to see if the door is still open, if the emotional supply is still available, esteem. It's about control, not care. And yet, it's easy to fall for it because it's subtle and often wrapped in emotional insight. They might sound reflective, softer, esteem, more vulnerable than you remember. They may express regret, nostalgia, even apology. They may remind you of the good times, of how special your connection was, of shared memories, esteem. They may say, you're the only one who truly understands me. And in that moment, it's almost irresistible to think, maybe this time is different. But let me be clear, esteem, appearances can be deceiving. Words without sustained, consistent action are not transformation. Insight without accountability is not change. Emotion without behavior is not care, esteem. And this is the trap of hope. Hoovering often preys on guilt. You may feel responsible for their unhappiness, for their regret, for their pain. You may think that if you respond, esteem, if you give them a chance, if you engage, you're helping them heal. But that's not healing. They're asking you to carry the weight of their emotions. And your compassion is being exploited, esteem. Sometimes the hoover is indirect. A provocative message, a subtle criticism, a flash of their old charm. Anything to get you to respond, to engage, to come back into the cycle. Attention, esteem, positive or negative, still counts as supply. And if they can pull you back even emotionally, the old dynamic is reactivated. Esteem, what's especially confusing is how quickly the familiar patterns return if you respond. The warmth fades, the criticism resurfaces, the unpredictability returns, esteem. And you're back in the emotional fog you thought you'd left behind. Each time this cycle repeats, it drains more of your energy, more of your clarity, more of your trust in yourself, esteem. Hoovering can occur multiple times, long after the relationship has ended, especially when you're beginning to move on, esteem. Especially when you're thriving in ways that threaten the narrative they created, that you were the problem, that they were the victim. Hoovering is their way of asserting control, esteem, even from the sidelines. Boundaries are everything in this phase, not as punishment, not as revenge, but as self-preservation. Every response you give, every explanation you offer, esteem, every attempt to earn things on good terms becomes an opening. The closure will not come from them, it comes from you, esteem. Your power is in deciding that the cycle no longer has access to your life, no longer has a foothold in your emotional world. It's natural to feel conflicted in this phase, esteem. There will be longing, doubt, confusion. You may wonder if you're overreacting, if you're being too harsh, if maybe you could try one more time. And that's human. It doesn't mean you're weak, esteem. It means your attachment system was manipulated. Understanding that is critical because shame is one of the strongest tools that keeps people tethered. Esteem. You may feel nostalgic for the beginning. You may remember the intensity, the connection, the sense of being seen and valued. But it's crucial to distinguish the fantasy from the reality. Esteem. The feelings you had were real, but the dynamic that supported them was not sustainable. The person who hoovers is not coming back to build a healthy, mutual relationship. Esteem. They are coming back to restore the power and attention they crave. Engaging with hoovering is tempting because it promises the return of connection, of validation, of intimacy, esteem. But what it actually does is keep you trapped in the cycle. It undermines the progress you've made. It makes you question your own perception, your own healing, esteem. It feeds the same patterns of self-doubt, accommodation, and overthinking that kept you in the relationship in the first place. This is why hoovering is so dangerous, esteem. It doesn't look like abuse. It doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like hope. And that hope can feel irresistible. That hope can make you think the story isn't finished, esteem. That the relationship can be saved, that this time will be different. But the story is finished. The difference is whether you let it define the next chapter of your life. At this point, esteem, reclaiming your power is crucial, saying no, maintaining distance, protecting your emotional space, recognizing that your value does not depend on someone who cannot provide consistent care, esteem, and trusting yourself enough to walk away, not because you're unkind, not because you're unforgiving, but because you are choosing your well-being over a dynamic that never served you, esteem. Part of the healing here is understanding that love without safety is not love. Empathy without boundaries is not connection. Intensity without mutual respect is not intimacy, esteem. And hoovering is a test of whether you will allow the cycle to continue. The answer is always in choosing yourself, esteem. Because the most powerful response to someone who relies on your engagement to regain control is disengagement, to step out of the cycle entirely, to stop responding, esteem, to refuse to let them dictate your emotional state. And that decision is not easy. It comes with grief, longing, and doubt. But it is also the moment when freedom begins, esteem. This phase teaches one of the hardest lessons of all. Someone can miss you, not because they value you, but because they miss the way you made them feel, esteem. And that is not a reflection of your worth, it is a reflection of their need for supply. Recognizing this distinction is crucial, esteem, because it allows you to reclaim the emotional power that has been misdirected for so long. Hoovering is a reminder that the cycle never truly ends until you choose to end it yourself, esteem. And each time you resist, each time you maintain boundaries, each time you trust your own perception over the pull of nostalgia, you are rewriting the story, esteem. You are choosing clarity over fantasy, self-trust over self-blame, freedom over manipulation. And ultimately, the moment you step out of the cycle, the hoover loses its power, esteem. Because the cycle only exists when you participate in it. When you disengage, the illusion collapses, and the narrative no longer has a grip on your life. And so, esteem, the lesson here is simple but profound. The power to end the cycle is yours. Not theirs, not in their words, not in their apologies, not in their nostalgia, esteem. Your power begins the moment you stop giving it away. And finally, we arrive at a stage that can feel almost unimaginable in the midst of all the chaos, the awakening. It's not dramatic, esteem, at first. There's no lightning bolt, no sudden clarity. It comes quietly, often through exhaustion and repeated experience, esteem. It's the point when you realize that you cannot continue to sacrifice your sense of self for someone who cannot or will not give you the respect, safety, and care you deserve, esteem. And once that realization lands, everything starts to shift. The awakening doesn't feel empowering at the beginning. It feels destabilizing. You begin to see patterns you cannot unsee, esteem. The idealization at the beginning, the subtle erosion, the devaluation, the discard, the hoovering. You start asking a different question than before. Instead of asking, esteem, what did I do wrong? You ask, why does this keep happening to me? And that question, as simple as it sounds, is the first crack in the cycle. At this point, education becomes essential. Esteem, learning about narcissistic patterns, trauma bonding, manipulation. It isn't about labeling or judging the other person. It's about understanding your own experience. Suddenly, esteem, the confusion and self-doubt start to make sense. You see that you were not imagining the behavior. You weren't too sensitive. You weren't failing at love, esteem. You were responding normally to an abnormal dynamic. That realization alone is like a breath of fresh air. This phase also brings grief, but a different kind of grief, esteem. Not just grief for the relationship, but grief for yourself. For the time you lost trying to make it work. For the version of you that lost confidence and self-trust, esteem. For the boundaries you didn't know how to hold. And that grief is heavy because it comes with clarity. You're no longer numbing yourself with fantasy. You're facing reality in its stark form, esteem. Healing at this stage isn't about moving on quickly. It's about slowing down, reconnecting with your intuition, your emotions, your own body. Many people realize that for a long time, they've been disconnected from themselves. They've been orienting their lives around the moods, needs, and approval of someone else. And now, they have the opportunity to begin living again for themselves. Boundaries become central, not walls, but definitions. You start practicing saying no without over-explaining. You stop chasing closure from someone who is incapable of giving it. You start reclaiming your emotional space, and even if it feels uncomfortable at first, it is liberating. Boundaries are not just rules, they are statements of self-respect. And with boundaries comes anger, and that anger, when understood, is a form of clarity. Anger is a signal, telling you that what happened was not acceptable. It restores a sense of dignity, counteracting the years of self-blame. The goal is not to stay angry, It is to use anger to fuel respect for yourself, to create internal rules that protect your well-being. The nervous system slowly begins to settle, You may notice that you can enjoy life again, even in small ways. Even moments of sadness feel manageable because your internal state is no longer dictated by someone else's volatility. That calm is a sign of progress. It is evidence that safety, emotional, psychological, is being reestablished. Identity begins to rebuild. You start asking, who am I without trying to manage someone else's emotions? What do I like? What do I value? What do I need? These questions can feel unfamiliar and even intimidating, but they are grounding. They shift the focus back to you. They remind you that your life doesn't have to revolve around someone else's dysfunction. Healing isn't linear, There will be moments of doubt, moments of missing them, moments of wondering if you were too rigid, too unforgiving, too cautious. Those feelings are normal. Trauma bonds don't dissolve quietly. But each time you choose clarity over fantasy, self-trust over self-blame, independence over manipulation, the bond loosens. Support is essential. Safe people, therapy, education, community. Healing from relational trauma doesn't happen in isolation. Consistent experiences of being believed, being respected, being emotionally met, these begin to rewrite old neural patterns. They restore trust in yourself and in the world around you. One of the most profound shifts in this stage is redefining love. You begin to see that love is not intensity, not drama, not obsession. Love is safety, love is consistency, love is mutuality. You start to understand that real connection does not require you to disappear. And once you internalize that, your standards shift, not because you demand more but because you finally align with your own well-being. You may also notice a deepening sense of strength, not the strength of enduring pain, but the strength of choosing to stop enduring it. That power was always there, it was just being misdirected towards survival instead of self-protection. And that realization is transformative. Breaking the cycle doesn't mean the memories vanish. You may think of them, you may feel longing, but the critical difference is that they no longer define you. Your life is no longer structured around their presence or their approval. You trust yourself to know what is safe and what is not. You trust your perception over nostalgia, your self-respect over manipulation. At this stage, you also understand the subtle dynamics of supply and control. You recognize that intensity masquerading as love was never about you, It was about them, and that clarity is liberating. You begin to see that your time, your energy, and your emotional availability are precious, and you no longer give them to someone incapable of honoring them. Recovery also brings empathy in the right direction. Not empathy for the narcissist, but empathy for yourself, Understanding that your compassion, your loyalty, your love were misdirected, and redirecting those qualities toward people and experiences that honor them, That redirection is both healing and empowering. This is the stage where freedom begins to feel real, where you realize that you are capable of self-trust, capable of boundaries, capable of healthy connection, where you understand that safety and love are not mutually exclusive, and where you finally step out of the cycle that defined so much of your past, And the most powerful lesson of this phase is simple: the cycle only has power if you participate in it. Your clarity, your boundaries, your self-respect, they are the antidote. No words, no apologies, no hoovering, no nostalgia from the other person can regain control if you refuse to give it. So the awakening isn't about revenge. It's not about closure from them, It's about reclaiming your life, your identity, your emotional freedom. It's about learning that you are enough, that you deserve safety, that you deserve consistency, That real love exists outside of manipulation and control. And in the end, the awakening is a quiet but profound triumph, It's the moment you stop surviving in someone else's story and begin living your own. It's the moment the cycle loses its grip. And it is the moment you finally recognize that your life, Your worth and your happiness are yours to claim, and no one can take that away.